Okay. Good afternoon, students. So we'll start where we picked up. We left last class, which is we'll start today with structure of antibody. Specifically, we'll talk about structure of IgG. So structure of immunoglobulin G. So if you can see, it's a monomeric structure of 4 interacting polypeptides, 2 large referred to as heavy or H chains and 2 small polypeptide referred to as light chains. So so these are the heavy chains and these smaller ones are the light chains. So now each heavy chain is linked to the light chain by one disulfide bond, and both of the heavy chains are linked to each other by 2 disulfide bonds. Now 3/4 of each of the heavy chain is made up of a constant sequence of amino acid, and the regions are demarcated as CH3, CH2 and CH1. This is the carboxy terminal of the polypeptide, and this here is the amino acid amino terminal. Similarly, in the heavy chain, 1/4 of the region consists of a sequence of variable amino acids. Similarly, in the light chain, half of the sequence of light chain consists of constant amino acid sequences and half consists of variable amino acid sequences. So the constant ones are known as CH1, CH2 and CH3, and the variable one is known as VH. V and C standing for variable and constant regions. Now similarly, in the light chain we have variable VL and CL. The next interesting point is, now the heavy chains, they have a flexible region in between the CH1 and CH2 domains, such that the antibody can actually bend and adopt a Y-shaped structure. So this flexible region is actually called as a hinge. Now just below the hinge region, the oligosaccharides are actually attached to the polypeptide chain, making the antibody structure a glycoprotein. Also, the N-terminal regions of both variable chains of heavy and light chain, they together constitute the region where the antigen will actually come and bind. Okay. So this site is actually known as the FAB site or the fragment antibody site. Okay. This is the antigen binding site. So if you can see from the structure, each this IgG, one molecule of IgG has 2 antigen binding sites. Also the constant, it's not that the constant regions of the antibody are without any function. These have effector function, which basically means that they help in aiding the complement system to neutralize the pathogens. Now next, coming to comparison of different classes of antibodies. Like we saw, there are 5 classes of antibodies: IgM, IgG, IgA, IgE and IgD. IgM is the very first antibody to be synthesized by the newborn. But as time progresses, IgG actually surpasses the amount of IgM found in the blood, becoming the principal circulating antibody. If you can see, IgG is found at a prevalence of 80%. Now IgM is actually a pentameric structure, and its total concentration in serum is only 6%. Now whenever the body encounters a novel antigen, so IgM is the first antibody to be developed against it. So IgM is involved in what is known as the primary response. However, the secondary response is elicited by IgG. Okay. Next comes IgG, is like we saw, it's a monomeric structure, and IgM is a pentameric structure. IgA is actually a dimeric structure. So it's found in concentration of like 13%. Now we know that the body has a lot of mucous membrane. So IgG is basically secreted into the mucus. IgA is secreted into the mucus. So this is basically found in mucus, tears and saliva. Then comes IgE. So Ig is involved it's also a monomer, and it is involved in allergic reactions. Then comes IgD. So IgD is actually involved in B cell maturation. Okay, so IgD is also monomeric in nature. So next comes antigen. What are antigens? So antigens, or also known as immunogens, these are whole organisms or molecules of foreign origin that can evoke an immune response and bind to antibodies in a species specific manner. Now, it's not that the whole of the antigen is actually what evokes an immune response, but it's a very specific part of it called the antigenic determinant or the epitope that actually is the immunologically specific and active part of an antigen. Now, there are many small molecules that invade the body. They are not, however, they do not have the capacity to evoke an immune response. So, those small molecules are actually called as haptens. So, haptens, only when they bind with a macromolecule, only then they can evoke an antibody, an antigen antibody response, or they can evoke an immune response. Next comes antigen antibody interaction. So, we saw that epitopes are the antigenic determinants of the antigen. Now, so epitope lies in the antigen. Now, the complementary part in the antibody that binds the antigen is actually referred to as paratope. Okay, this is called as paratope. Now, it is usually a small region consisting of 5 to 10 amino acid of the antibody's Fab region and contains the part of antibodies heavy chain and light chains. So, if you see, this is the epitope, okay, and here complementary to the epitope is the paratope. Okay. Next is how exactly the so whenever an antigen binds to an antibody, so the process is known as agglutination or precipitation. It is called precipitation because basically the antigen is rendered immobile. Also, after the antigen and antibody have formed a complex, macrophages will phagocytose those complexes and thus eliminate the antigen from the body. Now, we have already discussed the antibodies are primarily secreted by the plasma cells. Next, coming to the other part which we are going to discuss, which is the diseases. So, any harmful deviation from the normal structural or functional state of an organism associated with certain signs and symptoms and differing in nature is called a disease. So, a diseased organism commonly exhibits signs or symptoms indicative of its abnormal state. Now, diseases can be classified into acquired and congenital. Congenital diseases are those with which the infant is born, okay, and acquired are those which the infant, which while in the process of growth the individual acquires. So, acquired diseases are again classified into communicable and non-communicable. So, communicable diseases basically can can be transmitted from one person to another person, from one infected individual to a non-infected individual, and non-communicable diseases are those which cannot be transferred from one person to another person. Now, again, contagious are those diseases which are transferred upon touch. Okay, touch sensitive pathogens would come under this contagious diseases, and non-contagious are those which are which happen due to different other environmental agents such as soil, air, water, contaminated water. Now, non-communicable diseases are of 4 categories. So, first comes degenerative diseases, where age-related deterioration of physiology, body physiology occurs and the organism acquires diseases. Next is deficiency. So, whenever there is a deficiency of either macronutrients or micronutrients, there is a deficiency which leads to a disease state. Next is cancer. Now, cancer can be caused either due to internal intrinsic factors or due to extrinsic factors. And then allergy. So, first for today we will take up the communicable diseases, and then the non-communicable diseases we will try to cover it in the next class. So coming to the first communicable disease that we are going to study, which is rhinitis. Rhinitis is nothing but your common cold. So rhinitis is characterized by inflammation and irritation of the mucous membrane of the nose. Now rhinitis only it stays in the upper respiratory tract. It doesn't go below, it doesn't move to the lungs. Now so this rhinitis can be caused by viruses. So over 200 types of viruses cause it, and then it could be caused by only one bacteria is known, Dialister pneumosintes, which is known to cause rhinitis. So these, like I said, these infect the upper respiratory tract and cause inflammation. Now what are the different stages of rhinitis? So the first stage is invasion, which happens in a few hours. So here basically the sneezing, burning sensation in the nasopharynx, nasal obstruction, headache, and pruritus of nose. Next is the stage of secretion. Now in this stage basically there would be lower grade fever, malaise, general feeling of illness, then arthralgia, nasal obstruction, and then very profuse watery rhinorrhea, okay, running nose basically. Then comes the third stage of resolution. So basically whenever rhinitis is acquired, whenever a person gets common cold, it is usually resolved within 5 to 7 days. Okay, so this is the normal course of a rhinitis. I mean, when the condition is uncomplicated. But if the condition persists beyond 7 days, then these may be indicative of a secondary bacterial infection that has been established in the body. So next, coming to transmission, the most important part here is that rhinitis is transmitted through oozing droplets from talking and sneezing, and this can also spread through direct contacts like handshake or using common articles like pen, paper, or whatever common articles we can think of. So the treatment. Now first treatment is supportive treatment, where bed rest is advised, then painkillers, analgesics are advised, then nasal decongestant. So the most common problem in case of rhinitis is a blocked stuffy nose. So so these can be gotten rid of by nasal decongestants. So these basically liquefy the mucus to prevent crusting. And then if it's a viral rhinitis, then no antibiotics should be used. But however, if it's a bacterial rhinitis, antibiotics may be used. Next comes pneumonia. Now more than 10 million cases are reported in India every year. So pneumonia can occur either in one lungs or both lungs. So they are accompanied usually by the symptoms of coughing, fever, and difficulty in breathing. Now what exactly happens? So pneumonia causes inflammation in the alveoli. So alveoli basically is filled with fluid or pus. So this from time to time these can also contain RBCs. So the thing is, most of the time the body is effectively able to filter out these organisms, okay, but sometimes these can actually get access to lungs and they can cause infection. So these are more likely to happen when immune system is weak, when organism is very strong, or the body fails to filter the organisms. So there are two types of pneumonia basically: community associated pneumonia. This happens when it is contracted in daily life, such as while we go to school or we go to work. So and the second one is healthcare associated pneumonia, which is contracted when you visit a nursing home or a hospital, either during visitation or during hospitalization. So what are the factors that predispose to pneumonia? Cigarette smoking, upper respiratory tract infections if you already have a rhinitis, then alcohol, corticosteroid therapy. Corticosteroids basically suppress the immune system. Now old age, recent influenza infection, and pre-existing lung diseases. Now what are the factors, what are the different viruses and bacteria that cause pneumonia? So in viruses, influenza and respiratory syncytial virus can cause pneumonia. So viruses account for almost 10 to 36% of infection, and the most predominant bacteria which actually is responsible for pneumonia is Streptococcus pneumoniae. Okay. So the general symptoms are fever, cough production, sharp stabbing pain in the chest and breathlessness, and additional symptoms may include sweaty or clammy skin, loss of appetite, and in some cases confusion, especially in case of older people. Next is diagnosis. So diagnosis is by physical examination, by X-ray of chest, blood test, and examination of mucus from lungs. So in the X-ray, in general, it can be seen that the infected individual would have an opaque, will have opaque lungs. So the lungs would actually appear opaque. If you see, this is the lungs. This is the lungs of a infected person. This is the lungs of a healthy person. Now, when the pneumonia is caused by bacteria, antibiotics should be used in the treatment. Plenty of rest and rehydration is highly advised. And if it's a viral pneumonia, no antibiotics should be used. However, symptomatic treatment should be done. So most healthy people recover from pneumonia in 1 to 3 weeks. But sometimes if you have other health conditions, the situation can worsen and lead to life-threatening conditions. So next is prevention of pneumonia. So quitting smoking habits, better nutrition, respiratory hygiene measures will lead to prevention of pneumonia. Also vaccines. So pneumococcal polysaccharide vaccines, inactivated influenza vaccines, and live attenuated vaccines are available. So World Pneumonia Day is celebrated on November 12th. Okay. So next comes typhoid. Typhoid is also known as enteric fever. So what happens is that the causative agent, the pathogen here is Salmonella typhi. It's a bacteria. It can also be caused by a related bacterium called Salmonella paratyphi, which causes a usually less severe form of typhoid. So it's a major cause of morbidity and mortality. So currently WHO suggests that typhoid mostly annually 16 million cases are reported, and with greater than 6 lakh deaths. So transmission is by fecal oral route, contact with patients and carriers, contaminated water and food, flies and cockroaches. Now how do people get typhoid? So if you work or you travel to area where typhoid fever is prevalent or endemic, so if you work as a clinical microbiologist handling Salmonella back samples, if you have close contact with someone who's recently been infected, okay. Next is drinking contaminated water. Now a person with typhoid fever can be contagious between days to years. That is when they become a carrier of the disease. So normally in a population 3 to 5% of infected people actually go on to become carriers. Now prognosis. So usually with antibiotics, with appropriate antibiotics, the individuals recover from the disease. However, 30% of people who do not recover will die from it. So most of those who got sick had failed to receive a proper vaccination. Then with adequate treatment, less than 1% of victims should die. Now this is a emerging concern that actually the Salmonella bacterium has started to become multi-antibiotic drug resistant. Okay. So this is the pathophysiology of typhoid. So what happens is that the bacterium enters the body through contaminated food. So the bacillus is able to go to the small intestine and then invade the intestinal mucosa. So then there it is taken up by macrophages and transported to the regional lymph node. So Salmonella typhi basically multiplies in the intestinal lymphoid tissue, and then there it comes in contact with the enterocytes and M cells in the Peyer's patches. So this is the time where the patient exhibits symptoms of diarrhea. Now next, after the end of incubation period, the Salmonella basically enters the bloodstream. Now incubation period is typically 1 to 2 weeks. Okay. So end of incubation period, the bacteria enters the bloodstream, okay, which is known as the bacteremia phase. So because of this bacteria entering the bloodstream, the fever manifests. The next step is, now once the bacteria is in the bloodstream, it can invade gallbladder, biliary system, lymphatic tissues of the bowel and multiply in higher numbers. And then this bacteria is then passed on to intestinal tract, where it is excreted out in the form of stool. The entire duration of illness is 4 to 6 weeks. Now there are different stages. So in the first stage, basically, so the most important fact here is that slowly rising step ladder fashion of temperature. So the temperature over a period of 4 to 5 days will gradually rise. So there will be abdominal pain and myalgia, malaise, headache, constipation. Then second week, the symptoms of the first week will progress. Then end of next second week, there will be delirium and confusion, and if untreated, the person can enter coma and die. Also, at the end of first week, this rose spots may appear. So these are red patches on the skin, on which if you apply pressure, these spots will go away. Okay. Then third stage. So third stage is the patient becomes the fever actually becomes toxic. So there's significant weight loss. There's so the patient enters a typhoid state, which is basically characterized by apathy and then confusion and psychosis. Then there's also high risk of hemorrhage and perforation. Okay. Now the fourth week, if the individual survives the third week, so over the fourth week, the fever, mental state and everything will improve. Okay. The intestinal and neurologic complications may still occur, and there would be weight loss and profound weakness, but some survivors actually become the asymptomatic Salmonella typhi carriers. Okay. So how is typhoid diagnosed? The characteristic diagnostic test for it is the Widal test. So Widal test is nothing but the measure of the titer of antibodies that the body generates against the bacteria that causes the enteric fever. So next comes how do you treat typhoid? Rest, plenty of rest. Then medical care involves the usage of antibiotics and then corticosteroids if the fever is very high. Then antipyretics, drugs to bring down the temperature. Then diet. So because there's a lot of because there's diarrhea, there's a lot of loss of fluids. So fluid and electrolyte should be regularly taken. And then soft digestible diet is preferred in the absence of abdominal distension. The antibiotics that were commonly used were chloramphenicol, ampicillin and cotrimoxazole. So these three antibiotics are no longer used because the bacteria has already developed resistance against them. Now what if the patient has acquired typhoid, has reported typhoid fever for the first time? Then fluoroquinolones are good choices, would be a good choice of drug. But if the patient already has had one episode of typhoid fever, then third generation cephalosporins and azithromycin are a better alternative for treating the disease. Now treatment should be continued for 14 days, and also the chronic carriers, when they were treated for 4 weeks of ciprofloxacin, they may those who have already been treated, so we may need to change the antibiotic. Now as all the antibiotics are concerned, the course of an antibiotic should always be completed. It should not be left midway, because that would lead to drug resistance, development of drug resistance. Now how do you prevent typhoid? So first is personal hygiene. You wash your hands, then drinking boiled water. So those areas where water filtration systems are not good, it's always advisable to boil the water and drink it. Then clean fruits and vegetables and get vaccinated. Now vaccines for typhoids are available. So the first one is VI antigen vaccine. So this is basically an inactivated vaccine. So in subsequent classes we'll talk about what are the different types of vaccinations which are commonly used. So this is a inactivated vaccine, which basically means that the organism has been heat killed, or killing would be a strong word. It has been inactivated by heat such that it cannot revert back to its pathogenic state. So the dosage of VI antigen vaccine is 0.5 ml and it is administered intramuscularly. So this is given as a single dose, and efficiency is about 72% in 1.5 years after vaccination, and after 3 years it is about 50%. So another vaccination is also available, which is the oral TY21A vaccine. So this is an oral live vaccine. So 3 capsules are given orally on alternate days, okay, and the capsule is to be swallowed whole. The liquid form of the vaccine is more effective, but sadly it is not available in India. So the protective efficiency is 2 to 3 years, which basically means that every 3 years you need to revaccinate. Next communicable disease is amoebiasis. So this is the 4th leading cause of death from parasitic diseases worldwide. So this is mostly prevalent in developing countries where sanitation is poor. So this is not restricted to the tropics and subtropics, but occurs in temperate and even the Arctic and Antarctic zones. So the causative pathogen is Entamoeba histolytica. Where does it reside? It resides in the large intestine of man, specifically in the mucous and submucous layers. Now, the pathogen Entamoeba histolytica has 3 morphological forms. So the first one is the trophozoite or feeding or magna form. So this is basically the vegetative or growing state of the parasites. So this is present only in the mucosal and submucosal regions. So this is irregular in shape and has a pseudopodia, a single pseudopodia referred to as a monopodia. Now these are large and actively, these are motile. So these are the trophozoites are when they multiply in number in the intestine, they are passed in the dysenteric stools, and these trophozoites are actually what are used to diagnose the presence of entamoeba. So also one of the characteristic features of the trophozoites is that it contains a lot of RBCs, phagocytosed RBCs. Now it secretes histolysine that basically dissolves and destroys the mucous lining. If you see this is the structure of, this is the diagram of a E. histolytica trophozoite. Now apart from the ingested RBCs, another significant feature is the presence of a cartwheel shaped nucleus. Okay. Now next comes the precyst or the minuta form. Now this precyst is an intermediate stage between the non-infective trophozoite stage and the infective cyst stage. Now here actually the trophozoites slowly start, they undergo encystment. So here no RBC or food material is found in the endoplasm as the bacteria is trying to encyst itself. Now it contains a large glycogen vacuole and 2 chromatid bars. So this is in the process of secreting cyst wall around it and becoming a cyst. Now cyst is what is the infective stage of the parasite. So it is round or oval in shape. So this has a cyst wall surrounding it. Now the cyst wall is resistant to digestion by gastric juice in the human stomach. Now nucleus is a mature, in a mature cyst, the nucleus is a mature cyst is quadrinucleated, which basically means that 4 nucleus are present in the cell, in the cyst. Now the cytoplasm shows the presence of 2 chromatid bars and glycogen masses, but no RBCs or food particles. So this mature cyst is passed out in the stool in the from the infected patients, and this can remain for few days in the soil without any harm. So these cysts can be killed by desiccation or boiling. So if you see, so these so these are the 4 nucleuses, cartwheel shaped nucleus, which is present in the cyst. Now next coming to life cycle of the histolytica. So it starts with drinking contaminated water or food where the cysts are there. So once the human digests it, so the gastric environment of the stomach actually helps in breaking the cyst wall, so that when the organism actually enters the small intestine, the cyst wall has already dissolved, and then excistation occurs. Excistation means the trophocyte, or we do not call it trophocyte at this stage, but we call it a metacyst. So the cell basically which was encysted, it comes out. Okay, it starts, becomes motile again. Now this metacyst is quadrinucleated state. Now this actually now would go to the colon next, and in the colon this so the single metacyst will divide to form 8 trophocytes. So these trophocytes will further, they will keep dividing, and the trophocytes will actually colonize the colon now. Okay, they will they will infect the mucosal and submucosal layers, and then eventually after a lot of rounds of division, the excess of trophocytes will actually be converted into cysts, and this cysts will now be excreted in feces. Okay. Yeah, so the important thing here is that the life cycle of Entamoeba histolytica, it is monogenetic in nature, which basically means that it requires only one host to complete its entire life cycle. Now there are two types of amoebiasis: intestinal amoebiasis, which happens only in the intestine. Okay, so what are the symptoms? These are non-dysenteric amoebic colitis, pain in the intestine, and then acute amoebic dysentery. So in the dysentery, these typical Charcot-Leyden crystals are found, which are also along with the trophocytes, which are diagnostic features to find out if there is an infection. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So we were here. So extraintestinal amoebiasis is, so when trophocytes actually they invade the mucus and the submucosal layers, they sometimes can also enter the bloodstream, and they can migrate to different other locations, such as they can infect the liver, they can infect the lungs, they can infect the brain, they can infect the genitourinary tract, and they can infect the spleens. So these are the extraintestinal amoebiasis. Now next is, how do you diagnose them? So specimen is stool or pus or liver abscesses, sputum or biopsy samples. Now for intestinal amoebiasis stool, the macroscopic examination, which basically means that the color and odor, the fluidity of the stool. The next is microscopy. So this reveals the presence of trophocytes and the Charcot-Leyden crystals. Now next is the stool antigen detection. So ELISA is very helpful in detecting the antigen in the stool. For extraintestinal amoebiasis, this fluorescent methods are implied, and the different radiological techniques such as X-rays, MRI and CT scans are used. Next comes the clinical manifestation. Next comes the treatment actually. So for amoebiasis, 3 kinds of drugs are used. So luminal amoebicides, which basically means that while the trophocytes are in the lumen, it kills them. Next is tissue, when the trophocytes have already invaded the mucosal lining. So there these tissue amoebicides will work, and then there are certain drugs which actually will kill both luminal and tissue amoebicides. Also, oral rehydration and electrolyte replacement is a must in case of amoebiasis. Also, prophylaxis is maintaining personal hygiene, use of boiled drinking water, and protection of food from so next we'll move on to malaria. So malaria is derived from the Italian word mal area, which means bad air. So it was first discovered by Charles Leveran in the 1880s, who discovered actually the parasite with Plasmodium, and then Sir Ronald Ross, he was the first one to observe that the oocytes of the Plasmodium are found in the female Anopheles mosquitoes. So this is Charles Leveran, and this is Sir Ronald Ross. This is the most devastating human parasitic infection. So almost 40% of the world's population is infected by malaria, and WHO estimates that there are 350 to 500 million cases of malaria worldwide. and in India around 1000 deaths are reported annually because of malaria. So so there are 4 species of malarial parasites. So these are Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium ovale and Plasmodium malariae. So in 2004 a new species of Plasmodium called Plasmodium noelsi was actually discovered. So this was actually previously known to infect the primates, but was also found to infect humans. Now malaria is found in about 100 countries in the world. So these are malaria is mostly prevalent in warm and humid climates, and seen from the occurrence of malaria increases in between July to November in India. So for the development of the parasite, this 20 to 30 degree Fahrenheit temperature and then 60% humidity is a good enough condition. Now what are the symptoms of malaria? So basically the symptoms of malaria, they happen in 3 stages. So stage 1 is the cold stage or the rigor stage, where you get chills. So the chills can happen from 15 minutes to 1 hour. So the chills happen because of the release of merozytes into the bloodstream, and this is often preset with nausea, vomiting and headache. So the next stage is hot stage. So after the chills subside, so the fever may reach up to 40 degrees Celsius or 106 degree Fahrenheit and may last for 2 to 6 hours, associated with intense headache. So the pathogen starts invading the newer red blood cells here. So the stage 3 is the sweating stage or the defervescent stage, where the patient starts profusely sweating. So these cycles are frequently asynchronous and these are repeated every 48 to 72 hours. So in the Plasmodium malariae, so pyrexia may last for about 8 hours and more, and the temperature may exceed 41 degrees, basically very high temperature. Now what are the hosts that are involved in the transmission of malaria? So there are 2 hosts. So first is man, and then is the female Anopheles mosquito. This female Anopheles mosquito is the primary host, also the definitive host, which basically means that the sexual reproduction of the Plasmodium is completed in the mosquito, and then man is the secondary host or the intermediate host, which is required for the growth and development of the Plasmodium. Now in the man, the asexual cycle occurs, which is known as the caesogony, and the in the female Anopheles mosquito, the sexual cycle occurs, which is called the sporogony. So if you can see, so the sporogony is basically an exogenous sexual phase in the mosquito that happens in the mosquito, and the caesogony is what happens in the human inside the body. So let's start from here. Let's begin with what happens when the mosquito actually draws blood from an infected individual. So we'll start here. Okay, so the mosquito takes a blood meal. Okay, now the blood actually contains gametocytes, female and the male gametocytes. So inside the mosquito, the gametocytes develop into a macrogametocyte and a microgametocyte. Macrogametocyte is the female gametocyte and microgametocyte is the male gametocyte, which gets exflagellated, which basically means the flagella, it develops flagella. Now the microgametocyte and the macrogametocyte, they fuse together to form an eukinete. So this eukinete becomes active in 18 to 24 hours. So once active, the eukinetes penetrate the stomach wall of the mosquito, and they undergo encystation to form a oocyte. Now this oocyte, as we know, during cystation a lot of cysts usually contain a lot of nucleuses. So once the oocysts then release the contained sporocytes into the body cavity that migrate to the salivary gland of the mosquitoes, where they reside till the mosquito comes and bites a healthy individual. So next from here we would continue. These are the different phases, these different cycles that occur in a healthy individual. So within 60 minutes of the mosquito biting, these sporozoites actually dissolve, they disappear from the peripheral circulation, peripheral blood circulation. Okay, so these reach the liver cells, where they can either remain dormant for a long period of time and they are called hypnozytes, or they can actually they can form this they can form hepatic seasons. Okay, so so these hepatic seasons, they further rupture to release merozytes into the bloodstream. Now once released into the bloodstreams, these merozytes actually would go and infect the red blood cells. Now inside the red blood cells, these merozytes would actually develop further into trophozytes. Okay, so the mature trophozyte again would form seasont inside the RBC, and then the seasont stage would rupture to again release merozytes into the bloodstream. So now this cycle is repeated a couple of times. So basically what trophozytes, the trophozytes are the feeding forms. So trophozytes, what they basically do is they feed on the hemoglobin and the hemoglobin present in the RBCs and forms hematozoin. Now after each cycle of each of this, so I forgot to mention this. So the cycle that happens inside the liver cells is called the exoerythrocytic cycle, and the one that happens inside the RBCs is called the erythrocytic cycle. So now after each erythrocytic cycle, the concentration of hematozoin and merozytes increase in the blood, and this is what is responsible for bringing about manifesting fever. So now multiple cycles are repeated, and then there comes a stage where the immature trophozytes no longer form the seasont stage, but they differentiate to form the gametocytes. Okay, they would form the male and the female gametocytes. Now these gametocytes are actually released into the blood circulation, and these are taken up further by a mosquito to complete the sporogenic cycle. Now coming to the different comparison of different Plasmodium species. So the incubation period of Malary is the maximum, which is around 16 to greater than 40 days. Now the different parasites, the types of malaria that they cause are different. So what I basically mean is they are given different names. For example, Vivax, Plasmodium vivax causes benign tertian malaria, Ovale causes mild tertian malaria, Malary causes quaternary malaria, and then Falciparum causes pernicious cerebral or subtertian malaria. The important thing is that the chances of getting anemia is high in case of Falciparum. Okay. Next, moving on to the diagnosis of malaria. So the diagnosis can be done by taking smears of peripheral blood and then staining it with Giemsa. Giemsa is a dye, and then the other diagnostic process is rapid immunochromatographic assay, or the RDT, which is very rapid. So the smears that are taken from the peripheral blood can either be thick or thin. So if you see, this is a thin smear and this is a thick smear. So the thick smear contains a lot of erythrocytes, and then it's a good way to scan a large number of erythrocytes and find out if there's an infection. And the thin smear actually allows for the positive identification of the kind of malarial species that infects the host, and also to find out the best possible therapy for the infected individual. Now the treatment. So for uncomplicated Plasmodium vivax, chloroquine and primaquine is used. For Falciparum, artesunate, which is nothing but artemisinin derivative, is used. Then for mild mixed infections, this artemisinin based therapy is used. So even though the treatment is going on, monitoring and follow up should be done. So every day blood smear should be taken and repeated, so that the patient the infection status is closely monitored. Now WHO recommends this artemisinin combinatorial combination therapies for the treatment of malaria. Now prevention, it goes without saying, ways should be taken to avoid mosquito bites, and then chemoprophylaxis is necessary. So those people who are either visiting an region endemic of malaria, or those person who are already staying there should actually take prophylaxis to prevent it. So prophylaxis can be either short term or long term. Okay. Now World Malaria Day is celebrated on 25th April. Next comes ringworm. Now this is should not be confused with a worm. Ringworms are actually fungal infections. So these funguses are called dermophytes. So the infection is also known as tinea or dermatophytosis. Now the fungus here, this feeds on keratin. So ringworm occurs in people of all ages, but these are prevalent in children. So it often is found in warm, moist climates. So how are these transmitted from an infected person? So can be passed on from one person to another person through contact with infected skin or sharing combs or inanimate objects. Also it can happen from animals. So animals like dogs and cats and different other pets can also transmit the infection to humans, and then through soil. The different types and symptoms of ringworm are: this can happen on skin when where it is referred to as tinea corporis. So there's this typical ring-like structure, okay, and this is mostly itchy and may ooze fluid. So it can happen on scalp where it is referred to as tinea capitis. So here this may lead to balding and the issues of dandruff. Now next is in the feet, it is called tinea pedis. So here so there is itching and burning sensation in the toe, in the sole of the feet. Then it can happen in the nail, where actually in the finger, both in the toenail and fingernail, it causes yellowing and makes the nails brittle. It can happen in the face, where in the face the edges are not very distinct. Then in case of beard area, it may lead to breaking off of hair, and then these causes swelling and crusting. So in the hands, it is referred to as tinea manum. So it leads to basically thickening of the keratin layer, and then it can happen in the groin region, okay, and it can extend from the folds towards the inner thighs. Now there are two types of treatment. First is the topical treatment, where different drugs such as clotrimazole and ketoconazole, these are applied on the surface of the infection, or it could be systemic. So systemic, for example, some fungal infections like the one in scalp and nails, they do not respond well to topical treatments. For these treatments, for such infections, oral medications are advised. Now ringworm is actually a preventable condition, and a patient in 2 weeks to 1 month can recover from the infection. Now oral medications are usually given a 3 months course. They are given a 3 months course. Now next comes filariasis. So filariasis is a parasitic disease caused by roundworms of roundworms. So these are spread by black flies and mosquitoes, specifically the Culex, Aedes and Anopheles mosquitoes. So 90% of all the infection is caused by Wucheria bancrofti. The remainder may be caused by Brugia malayi or Brugia timori. So the disease causes lymphedema, which is basically swelling of the lymph glands. Then lymphadenitis, which is infection of lymph vessels. Lymphangitis, which is infection of lymph vessels. Elephantiasis, which is enormous enlargement of scrotum, feet, hands or legs. Now impact. Now people usually with filariasis, they are shunned away, okay. So these affect the livelihood of people. So Next comes, let's talk about the causative organism, which is the Wucheria bancrofti. So these are white, slender, roundworms. So these live for about 5 to 7 years and they block the lymphatic system. So the different mosquitoes which act as vectors are in Africa Anopheles, in America Culex, and in the Asia Pacific and Asia Mansonia and Aedes species of mosquitoes. So the adults, the females are usually longer than the males. The larvae is called a microphyllary, and it is actually sheathed and has a nocturnal activity, which basically means that the parasite is more active during the night. Yeah. So the tail of the microphyllary is actually curved. It is tapered to a point. Now this nuclear columnar cells are seen throughout its body, if you can see in the figure. Next is the life cycle of Filary. So let's begin here. The mosquito actually bites a healthy individual, and what happens here is that the L3 larvae actually are secreted or excreted out on the skin. Okay, they are secreted on the skin. Now these larvae, they would actually take the path of the bite of the mosquito, and they would enter the bloodstream. Okay, they would actually migrate to the lymphatic nodes, where they would develop into adults. So these adults would again produce microphyllary, which would circulate in the bloodstream and can be taken up again by a mosquito during blood meal. So this microphyllary, these penetrate the mosquito's midgut, and there they develop, specifically they go to the thoracic muscles and they develop further into an L3 larvae, which again is L3 larvae, which again it would migrate to the proboscis of the mosquito, and the cycle would repeat itself. Then diagnosis. So normally the diagnosis of filaria was quite difficult, because the parasite was mostly active during the night. But now new detection techniques have come into picture. For example, the antigen detection, specifically the filaria antigen, CFA, circulating filaria antigen. This has been considered a gold standard for diagnosing the infection. Also, patients are checked for their filarial IgG antibodies in the blood serum. Next is treatment. So how do you treat filaria? First is first objective is to eradicate the microphyllary from the blood of infected individuals, and then for general infection, this DEC, diethyl carbamazine, is used at a quantity of 6 mg per kg. Also these drugs such as ivermectin and albendazole are used in treatment. So these drugs have a lot of side effects like fever, myalgia, and occasionally rash and itching. So prevention is to stay away from mosquito bites, and then taking a prophylactic regimen of this DEC if you are traveling to a filaria endemic region. Now last of the communicable diseases is the ascariasis. So this is actually caused by the pathogen Ascaris lumbricoides. So this is the largest nematode which actually infects the human. So this is an intestinal worm. So this is more common in children, and as many as 500 to 5,000 adult worms are found in a host. So as many as 500 to 5,000 adult worms are found in the single host. So this happens when an individual actually swallows the infective eggs of Ascaris. So so this has a worldwide distribution, but this is prevalent in the tropical and subtropical regions with poor sanitation measures. So coming to the morphology of adults, so the female is longer than the male, but the male has a curved ending, posterior ending. Now coming to life cycle of Ascaris. So it starts with the unfertilized egg. Now an unfertilized egg will not undergo any further development, but a fertilized egg actually undergoes further development, as in it actually undergoes embryonation, which basically means that inside the egg the embryo starts developing. So the embryo actually reaches the L3 larva stage. Okay, so this embryonated egg with L3 larva is actually the infective egg of the Ascaris. So this, when ingested, actually goes to the passes through the stomach, where the stomach gastric juices help to break the egg membrane, and then the L3 larva is now free in the intestine. So in the intestine, actually from the intestine they enter the bloodstream and they go to the liver. So from the liver, through the systemic circulation, they further they go to lungs, where they incubate for like 10 to 14 days. So from the lungs actually they would climb up, and they would enter the digestive tract again, and they would again be swallowed, and they will be taken again to the intestine, where they actually copulate, and then the eggs would be produced again and released through the feces into the environment. So what are the symptoms? So the stage one is when worm larvae it attaches itself to the bowel walls. So in the stage 2, when it enters the lungs, so there you can have difficulty in breathing or coughing or pneumonia, because inflammation and hemorrhage results in pneumonia. In the third stage, when the worm is in the small intestine, there could be a lot of abdominal symptoms such as abdominal discomfort or intestinal blockage or severe abdominal pain, vomiting, restlessness, disturbed sleep. Now the treatment, so diagnosis, this is diagnosed through examination of the stool, because in the stool eggs and sometimes Ascaris, individual Ascaris worms are passed. So treatment includes the different following drugs, and then in regions where ascariasis is predominantly found, so mass periodic deworming measures are taken up to get rid of the infection in the blood. Next is prevention and control. The same measures would follow: keeping good sanitation, hygiene, maintaining good hygiene, then avoiding polluted soil. Then vegetables should be thoroughly washed, fingernails should be routinely cleaned and cut to avoid the collection of dirt and eggs in them, and hands should be properly washed during eating. Okay, that's all for today's class. Thank you.